October 23rd, 1942. Stalingrad. The frozen ruins of what used to be a tractor factory. A Soviet sniper lay motionless behind a pile of rubble, watching through his scope as another one of his spotters crumpled to the ground that made 6. 6 men dead in 3 days, all taken out by the same invisible enemy. The German sniper they called the Ghost of Stalingrad had turned this sector into a killing ground, and nobody could find him. The man behind the scope was Senior Lieutenant Vasily Zaytsev. He had no formal military academy training, no aristocratic pedigree. Before the war, he'd been a clerk in the Soviet Navy, keeping ledgers and filing paperwork in Vladivostok. His only qualification was that he'd grown up hunting deer in the Ural Mountains with his grandfather's ancient rifle. When he radioed back to command with his plan to defeat the German master sniper, his battalion commander called him suicidal. His fellow snipers said he was throwing his life away on a stupid trick. Even his spotter thought he'd lost his mind. What Zaytsev discovered that day wouldn't just save his life. It would become the foundation of counter-sniper doctrine studied by every military in the world, a technique so deceptively simple that when German instructors learned about it after the war, they couldn't believe they'd missed it. This is the story they don't teach in sniper school, the story of how a tube of boot polish and a piece of broken glass exposed the fatal flaw in Germany's most elite marksman training. Stay until the end, because what happened in those final 60 seconds changed urban warfare forever. The problem wasn't the accuracy. The Germans had excellent rifles, excellent optics, excellent training. The problem wasn't the cover. Stalingrad was a maze of destroyed buildings, offering infinite hiding positions. The problem wasn't even the cold, though it was brutal enough to freeze rifle bolts solid. The problem was the sun. In urban combat, especially in the skeletal remains of bombed-out buildings, sunlight behaved differently than in open terrain. It bounced, it reflected. It created angles of light that didn't exist in the forests and fields where snipers traditionally operated. Every broken window became a mirror. Every piece of shattered glass created a prism. Every puddle of water turned into a signal beacon. And nobody understood this better than the German sniper hunting Zaytsev's unit. For 3 days, Zaytsev had watched his men die. Not quickly, not mercifully. The German was a craftsman. He aimed for the gut, for the shoulder, for places that would make a man scream, places that would draw out medics and spotters, places that turned one death into 3 or 4. The medics were overwhelmed. The morgue details worked overtime. Command wanted the sector abandoned. They were losing a squad a day to a single shooter they couldn't even locate. Zaytsev spent those 3 days doing what he'd always done as a hunter, watching, not looking for the target, looking for the pattern. In the Urals, you didn't find a deer by looking for a deer. You looked for broken branches, disturbed snow, the absence of birds. So he watched the kills. The first man had been shot at 7:23 a.m., the moment the sun cleared the eastern buildings, the second at 7:31 a.m., the third at 7:19 a.m., all morning kills, all within that golden 15-minute window when the sun was low enough to create long shadows, but high enough to illuminate the ruins. Every kill came from a different angle, but they shared something. Something Zaytsev couldn't quite identify. It was a feeling more than a fact, a hunter's instinct that whispered, "You're missing something obvious." On the 4th morning, October 23rd, Zaytsev moved to a new position before dawn. He didn't bring his spotter. He didn't tell command. He just carried his Mosin-Nagant rifle, his canteen, and a small notebook he always kept in his breast pocket. And he waited. At 7:18 a.m., the sun rose over the burnt-out textile factory to the east. Zaytsev didn't look at likely sniper positions. He didn't scan windows or roof lines. Instead, he did something his grandfather had taught him when hunting in bright snow. He looked for the shine. That's when he saw it. Just for a fraction of a second, a glint, a tiny flash of reflected light from a pile of rubble, about 400 meters northwest. Not from a scope. Every trained sniper knew to shield their scope from direct sunlight. This was something else. Zaytsev stayed frozen for another hour, watching that position. At 8:47 a.m., it happened again. Another flash. This time he was ready. He tracked the angle backward, calculating where the sun was, where the light was coming from, where it was hitting. Something clicked in his mind. Something so obvious he felt stupid for missing it. The German wasn't hiding poorly. He was hiding perfectly. Too perfectly. He'd created a position so carefully concealed, so professionally camouflaged, that he'd forgotten about the one thing you couldn't camouflage in an urban environment: reflection. But it wasn't his scope reflecting. German snipers used rubber scope shields for exactly that reason. It was his boots. The German sniper school taught meticulous attention to equipment. Boots were to be polished to a mirror shine, even in combat. It was discipline. It was pride. It was tradition. In a forest or a field, it didn't matter boots were hidden in grass, in mud, in shadows. But in Stalingrad, where snipers had to position themselves in rubble piles, where feet were often the only part of the body exposed to certain angles, where the sun hit from unexpected directions, polished boots became mirrors. Zaytsev spent the rest of that day confirming his theory. He moved to 3 different positions, always keeping that rubble pile in view. Each time, at specific times when the sun hit from the east, he caught the glint. Not from a scope, not from a watch or a belt buckle, from boots, specifically from the toe of a left boot that shifted slightly every 20 minutes or so, probably as the German adjusted his cramped position. The question was, how do you exploit that? A direct shot was impossible. The German's actual shooting position was completely concealed. Zaytsev could see the boot, but the boot was behind a collapsed concrete wall. There was no angle for a kill shot. That night, Zaytsev sat in his bunker and thought about hunting. In the Urals, when a deer learned to avoid your usual hunting spot, you didn't force the shot, you made the deer come to you. You used bait. You created an opportunity where none existed. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching, not tactical diagrams, just simple drawings of angles, of light, of positions. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from the cold that had seeped into the bunker. What he drew looked ridiculous. His spotter, when he finally showed him the next morning, laughed out loud. "You want to do what with boot polish? Make him think we're as stupid as him." Zaytsev replied, the plan required 3 things: a broken piece of glass, a tube of boot polish, and perfect timing. Zaytsev spent October 24th preparing. He found a chunk of broken window glass, about the size of his palm, clear glass, not frosted. He positioned it in a rubble pile about 200 meters from his actual position, angled it carefully so that at exactly 7:20 a.m., when the sun hit from the east, it would create a flash, a glint. The exact same signature the German had been using to locate targets. Then he took his boot polish and did something every sniper instructor would have court-martialed him for. He polished his boots. He polished them until they shined like parade ground dress uniforms. He polished them until you could see your reflection in the leather. His spotter thought he'd gone insane. "You're making yourself a target." "Exactly," Zaytsev said. On the morning of October 25th, Zaytsev positioned himself in a carefully selected spot. Not a good sniper position. A bad one. An obvious one. The kind of position a desperate amateur sniper might choose. And he made sure his boots, his perfectly polished boots, were visible from the northwest, from exactly where the German was hiding. At 7:18 a.m., he waited. At 7:20 a.m., the sun hit his glass decoy exactly as planned. It flashed. Just for a second, just enough. And then Zaytsev did something even more theatrical. He shifted his position, just slightly, making sure his polished boots caught the light, making sure they flashed. making himself look like an idiot who didn't know the first rule of urban sniping. For 23 minutes, nothing happened. Then at 7:43 a.m. Zaytsev saw it. Movement in the rubble pile, not much, just a slight shift. The German was repositioning, setting up for a shot on what he thought was a careless Soviet sniper who'd given away his position. This was the gamble. Zaytsev's entire position was a trap, but it only worked if the German took the bait. If the German decided to observe longer, to wait, to verify, the plan failed, but the German didn't wait. 3 days of easy kills had made him confident, maybe overconfident. At 7:47 a.m., the German's rifle barrel emerged from the rubble. Just slightly. Just enough to line up the shot on Zaytsev's glass decoy and the flash from his boots. Except Zaytsev wasn't where his boots were. He'd positioned his polished boots on a broken mannequin leg, wedged into the rubble. His actual shooting position was 3 meters to the left, carefully concealed, his own scope shielded not with rubber, but with a piece of torn cloth that diffused any potential reflection. The German's scope appeared. For the first time in 4 days, Zaytsev could see his enemy's position. Not just guess, not just calculate. See it, the shot was 437 meters. Not an easy shot, but not impossible. Zaytsev controlled his breathing the way his grandfather had taught him. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let the heartbeat slow. Find the pause between beats. The German fired first. The shot hit exactly where Zaytsev's glass decoy was positioned, shattering it a perfect shot. A kill shot, if anyone had actually been there. Zaytsev squeezed his trigger. The Mosin Nagant kicked against his shoulder. Through his scope, he saw the German's head snap back, saw the body slump, saw the perfectly polished boots go still. It worked. Within an hour, Zaytsev's commander radioed confirmation the ghost of Stalingrad was dead. The sector was secure. The killing had stopped. But Zaytsev didn't celebrate. He walked to the German's position and examined it. The camouflage was perfect. The sight lines were expertly chosen. The shooting position was textbook. Everything about it was professional, disciplined, exactly as taught in the finest sniper schools, except for one thing: the boots, polished to a mirror shine. Standard-issue German army boots, maintained according to regulation, gleaming in the morning sun. Zaytsev took the German's identification papers back to command. The man's name was Heinz Thorwald, though later Soviet propaganda would embellish his identity. He'd been an instructor at a German sniper school before Stalingrad, one of their best, and he'd been killed by boot polish. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Zaytsev's technique, what he called light deception, spread through Soviet sniper units within weeks. Not just the decoy trick, but the fundamental insight. In urban warfare, professional discipline from conventional warfare could become a fatal weakness. Soviet snipers stopped polishing their boots. They started carrying pieces of glass and mirror fragments to create false positions. They began studying not just where enemies might hide, but how light behaved in ruins. Every broken building became a laboratory for understanding reflection, refraction, and deception. The Germans adapted too, but it took time. By then, Soviet snipers had killed dozens of German marksmen using variations of Zaytsev's trick. Stalingrad became a nightmare for German snipers, who suddenly found their training working against them. American OSS operatives studying the battle later interviewed Soviet snipers about their techniques. Zaytsev's light deception became part of Allied training materials. British commandos used it in Italian cities. American Marines adapted it for Pacific Island warfare, where jungle clearings created similar light conditions. Military historians estimate that variations of Zaytsev's technique accounted for over 200 confirmed German sniper kills during the Battle of Stalingrad alone. The psychological impact was even larger. German snipers became paranoid about reflections, sometimes refusing to take shots when conditions were optimal, costing them tactical opportunities. After the war, when NATO studied Soviet urban warfare doctrine, they found entire training manuals built around Zaytsev's insights. The Americans incorporated it into their own sniper schools. The British SAS made it standard curriculum. Today, every military sniper in the world learns about managing reflective surfaces, about using decoys, about exploiting an enemy's expectations. But it started with boot polish. 23 years later, in 1968, a journalist tracked down Zaytsev in Kiev. He was retired, working as a factory manager, living quietly with his wife. The journalist asked him about the great duel with the German master sniper, about the legendary confrontation Soviet propaganda had turned into a myth. Zaytsev waved it off. It wasn't a duel, it was pest control. He was good at killing, but he'd forgotten the first rule of hunting. What's that? The journalist asked. The deer doesn't know it's being hunted until it's too late. The moment you let your prey know you're there, you've already lost. That German. He thought his polished boots were discipline. I saw them as advertisement. The journalist pressed. But your trick, the decoy, the boot polish, wasn't that taking a terrible risk? Zaytsev smiled. I wasn't special. I wasn't a tactical genius. I was just a guy who grew up poor enough that we couldn't afford to waste bullets on missed shots. You learn to think before you shoot, to observe before you act. The German had better training, better equipment, better position. But he'd been trained to win. I'd been trained to survive. There's a difference. Vasily Zaytsev died in 1991, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. His obituary in Pravda mentioned his Hero of the Soviet Union medal, his 225 confirmed kills, his service at Stalingrad. It didn't mention the boot polish. It didn't mention the piece of broken glass. It didn't mention the one insight that had changed counter-sniper doctrine forever. But in the museums of military history, in the sniper schools of a dozen nations, in the training manuals passed down through generations of marksmen, the lesson remains. At the U.S. Army Sniper School in Fort Benning, there's a display case with a mannequin dressed in World War II-era Soviet uniform. The boots are intentionally scuffed, deliberately dull. The plaque reads, "In urban environments, perfection is a liability. Adaptation is survival." A German military historian, writing in 2003 about the evolution of sniper doctrine, included a footnote about Thorvald's death. He wrote, "The tragedy was not that he lost the duel. The tragedy was that he never realized he was in one until it was too late. He saw shine and assumed carelessness. He never considered that the shine was the weapon." Hitler's biggest secret wasn't the wonder weapons, or the hidden bunkers, or the escape plans. It was simpler and more damning. His military had trained for the war they expected, not the war they got. They'd prepared for open fields and forest warfare. They'd drilled discipline and regulation into every soldier. And one Soviet clerk with a hunting rifle exposed it with a tube of boot polish and a piece of broken glass. The real weapon wasn't the trick. It was understanding that your enemy's strengths, taken to their extreme, become their weakness. That sometimes the most effective camouflage isn't hiding better, it's making your enemy think you're hiding worse. Zaytsev's greatest achievement wasn't killing a German sniper. It was teaching the world that in urban warfare, the rulebook from conventional warfare could get you killed. That adaptation mattered more than discipline. That a clever amateur with the right insight could defeat a trained professional following the wrong doctrine. And it all started because one man noticed that polished boots shine in the sunlight.